Okay, we're gonna get started. Ooh, okay. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to be getting started shortly. Feel free to drop your name, your pronouns, and where you're based, and we'll read it out, but we're going to be getting started shortly, okay? Hi, everyone. Thanks y'all so much for being here. We are going to get started shortly, but please feel free to drop your names or share your names, your pronouns, and where you're based in the chat. We just love to shout out folks and just see where folks are. Thank y'all so much for being here for another amazing teach-in for the School for Black Feminist Politics, this time led by Cam Morris. So thank y'all so much for being here. We're gonna get started shortly. I wanted to tell you, Cam, your other teaching, a lot of folks asked me to send me your other teaching too. So I'm just really happy you're here again. So thank you so, so much. This is so great. We're gonna be getting started shortly. It's 4:30 now. And we're just gonna wait for a few more moments for more folks to pop in. But please, y'all, please feel free to share your name, your pronouns, where you're based. Love to just shout y'all out. We are always so excited to have countless folks from all over the world join in on the School for Black Feminist Politics teaching. So please feel free to do that as we wait to a few more moments to get started. Yeah, just please let us know where you're based, your name, your pronouns, where you're based. Hi, Raven. How are you doing? She, they from Los Angeles. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it so much. All right, more folks are popping in. Thank y'all so much for being here. I'm going to get this event started because I really want to honor Cam's time. And so as more folks pop in, please, like I said before, please feel free to drop your name, your pronouns, where you're based. Love to shout y'all out. But hello, everyone. Once again, thank you so much for being here. My name is Jamie Swift, and I am the Executive Director of Black Men Radicals. Black Men Radicals is a Black feminist advocacy organization dedicated to uplifting and centering Black women and gender-expansive peoples' radical activism in Africa and the African diaspora. You are here today to learn from the amazing Cam Morris and their teaching on our legacy, self-determination, bodily autonomy, and anti-state practices for Black birthing justice for the School for Black Feminist Politics. The School for Black Feminist Politics is the political education arm of Black Men Radicals with the mission of empowering Black feminisms and Black politics by offering free teachings about Black feminist thought and behavior. So before I properly introduce Cam, I want to share a couple of things. Please note that live closed captioning is available, and I want to thank our closed captioner for today, Jason Cunningham, for being here with us. Also, I want to establish that this is a safe space, right? So no transphobia, ableism, queerphobia, racism allowed. Please be respectful to this space, our guests, and the audience in the chat. So I just want to properly introduce Cam because I have the honor of introducing Cam. Cam Morris, they, them. They're originally from the southside of Chicago, now residing in Washington, D.C., occupy Piscataway land. Cam is a neuroexpansive, non-binary Black radical community organizer. Holding a Black queer feminist abolitionist politic, the focus of Cam's work is combating colonization and neoliberalism against U.S. occupation and war, patriarchal violence, and capitalism. And we have the wonderful opportunity to have Cam again because they led another teach-in for the school last year on abolition. So thank you so much, Cam, for all the work that you do, and just want to give it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jamie. I'm going to share my screen, y'all. So here we are. My name again is Cam. Grateful to be here with y'all. Grateful y'all took the time out your day to spend here. I hope this space is affirming, grounding, and yeah, I'll just start by going through some things as far as housekeeping and care plans. So I first just want to introduce myself again. Cam spelled C-A-M. I do want to describe what I'm wearing just for the recording and for those who may be engaging, who may be vision impaired. I am wearing a high ponytail with long red locks and a long sleeved shirt. One half is Black, one half is white. Thank y'all so much for being here today again. So again, just doing some introduction to this workshop space today. It's so much to cover related to reproductive justice, Black birthing justice, and we only have so much time. But glad that y'all are here. So this virtual teach-in will explore the depths of Black birthing justice, addressing structures of violence like bioessentialism, colonialism, humanness, eugenics, transmisogynoir, white feminism, and anti-abortion legislation. It will examine the power, autonomy, and rebellious practices of Black birthing communities, midwives, and doulas, and contemporary efforts towards Black birthing justice and reproductive justice. And just for the recording too, I'll be referring to my notes here, just so folks are aware. And so also the plan is to investigate the impact of identities on healthcare outcomes, identify Black birthing people displayed in media and those who have been displayed in the history of Black birth, Black birthing justice, examine oral histories, language, herbs, spirituality, and community, which have been used as practices for repo and birthing justice, to agitate, activate, and educate Black folks on how powerful and liberating our legacy is, highlighting how divisive Western medicine has been to building Black and birthing justice. I'm also going to try to catch myself and slow down as well by speaking. So as well as combating cis-centered feminized reproductive healthcare, which ostracizes and alienates trans, non-binary, and intersex people. Illustrate how issues of ageism, ableism, population control, eugenics, transphobia, sterilization, and violence are rooted in institutions of white supremacy, like the medical system, US legislation, social norms that threatens the lives and experiences of birthing people. This will be testifying and retelling the stories of our sacred legacies in an important way to continue this ancestral work and a tradition of community care. And Black folks all around the diaspora have resisted, rebelled against birthing injustice. I do also want to say that once I get into the slides, I'll be doing a description. I'll first speak out the language that's listed on the slide, but I'll also do an image description. This current image is a Black and white photo of Venus of Willendorf. And folks can research who this quote unquote deity is, and this fertility thought of as a fertility god. That's the first image here. And so I'll be using image descriptions as I navigate through the slideshow. And I want to recognize also the limits of traditional quote unquote bio or based in binary definitions of gender, at the same time as it chronicles and analyzes histories that these definitions have produced. We would try to practice warnings before sharing information that potentially can be harmful. And so that kind of leads to the care plan, wanting folks to please take care of yourself in this space. A lot of the things that will be covered may be heavy content. So take breaks if you need to, mute the presentation, mute me, take some space to journal, take some space to look away from the screen, maybe look at an object that's 10 feet away to get your vision refocused, and just take a screen break. Okay, y'all. All right, so the agenda for today, we're first going to be thinking about who's to blame in this birthing and reproductive injustice. Then we're going to think about the birthing movement from the beginning, rebellion during enslavement. We'll talk about continued warfare on Black reproductive rights, birth control, sterilization, and repro rights, Black birthing justice leaders, and we'll talk about transmisogyny, Black essentialism, Black bioessentialism, anti-trans and anti-abortion bills, and then we'll talk a little bit more about repo-futurism. So I do want to begin with a quote. This is from Sister Song, and I'll be referring to them a few times in this presentation, and we'll have some links for them available in the reading list that will go out after the presentation. The human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, have children, not have children, and parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. And I'm thinking about that as we kind of go into the next portion of identifying values, specifically as it relates to this presentation in this space today. So in my mind and my thinking as someone who's confronting this work as an abolitionist, I'm also thinking about all the systems that are at play, but also the ways that Black folks have been historically building practices of resistance and rebellion, which we're going to see continued kind of as a thread throughout the presentation. And so in my mind, I see these systems like incarceration, further criminalization, this larger global criminalization, transphobia, maternal death, it's all of these things that kind of relate to the issue we're discussing today, but that all impact Black birthing folks' health and healthcare outcomes. And so I do want to highlight a few themes. First, self-determination, which is something that Black folks have used forever to be able to determine our conditions, our community, our values, and what's important to us. Also want to highlight that thinking and determination not being monolithic in Black communities all across the diaspora, varying in things that they may feel valuable and customs and traditions. I also want to think about autonomy and the conversation from today continuing to kind of come back to this idea of agency, power, and body autonomy. I'm also thinking about this in the space of Black feminism. And so what are the political, social, and economic injustices that impact our communities? How have folks that are particularly considered women or gender oppressed folks impacted by these systems? And what can be done to not only repair, but liberate and build continued community care for each other? I'm also thinking about this in the terms of an anti-state rhetoric. And so I'll define the state in a bit, but my thinking is that when Black birth is interrupted and impacted by state, it particularly exposes folks to state violence, the threat of folks' lives, experiences, And that overlaps to like climate injustice, the climate crisis, and all of these other issues that impacts our communities. I'm also thinking about community and collective power and how folks throughout this presentation are going to kind of display that power building. And this also is a pro-abortion space. And so I'll be talking about how ancestors, Black folks in the past have used abortions as ways to combat and resist and rebel for their right to their agency and autonomy. And so I'll also be talking about issues related to white supremacy, patriarchal violence, imperialism, and capitalism, and how they overlap with ideas of scarcity, urgency, which all have kind of impacted birthing folks in their everyday lives. I'll also be addressing ableism, right? And so thinking about this in the context of today's presentation, children are among the most marginalized, abused, and exploited community. And so we'll think about what does this kind of right have to do with the livelihoods of children and young folks. And so this first one, I want to ask folks to use the chats if you can answer this question. So what systems do you think are to blame for repro injustice? What systems are to blame for birthing injustice? And if folks can use the chats to kind of share maybe some things that are coming up for them. And I will, continue to move forward while folks are kind of engaging. I first want to define repro justice to build context for the space. And so Sister's Song is using this repro justice framework to define one, the ability to decide when and when to have a child and the conditions under which they will give birth. Two, decide if they will not have a child and their options for preventing and ending a pregnancy. Three, parenting children that already have the necessary social supports and safe environments in healthy communities and without fear of violence from individuals of the government. Four, bodily autonomy, free of all forms of reproductive oppression. And so birthing justice, which I would see more as something centered in like Black folks and Black folks thinking. And I think there are some connections with repo and that sort of fight with white feminism, and I think kind of like the push for population control, which we'll get into a little bit in the future. But defining birthing justice is a present day birthing justice movement honors its ancestors. A major birthing justice is a system eradication of the Black midwife in her community by the Eurocentric patriarchal medical system. Certainly, the experience of being a woman has generally included being targeted by various kinds of sexual, reproductive oppression and brutalities. I do not acknowledge womanhood as a monolithic and know that the experience of women and birthing people are impacted all by class, desirability politics, access, transphobia, etc. And our gender identities are not limited by our access to safe, sustainable, and affirming healthcare, which is a human right that we all deserve. And so I do want to continue with thinking about the state before we further this conversation. And so Wikipedia is defining a state or the state as a centralized political organization that imposes and enforces rules over a population within a territory. There is no undisputed definition of the state, a widely used definition that maintains a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, although other definitions do not describe it as such. And so when I think about the state, I think in literal definitions, I think about the ways that the government is able to be in control, and there'll be some overlap in how the government, the state, policy, social norms kind of shifted our thinking about Black birthing justice, midwives, home births, doulas, and things that relate to our traditions and our livelihood. And so an example of just thinking about the state I'm thinking here is when the practice of midwifery was considered illegal if you did not have a state issued certificate and Western training. And so when we think about the illegal practice could result in legal action. And so in this example, the state would be the legal factor that could potentially impact someone who may be a midwife and practicing impact their work. And so in this way, this particular kind of state violence is kind of targeted towards folks that are Black and practicing birthing justice. And so I'll also be talking a little bit about imperialism because there's a lot of overlap in this kind of large machine of white supremacy and its producing of all of the things related to settler colonialism, I would say European beauty standards, all of the things related to that impacts our daily lives and that oppress us. Also, as it relates to patriarchal violence, domestic violence, gender-based violence, and how those impact birthing folks at higher rates than other groups of people. Also, as it relates to imperialism. And so imperialism can be a lot of things from like a ROTC program at a high school, which in turn is probably targeting Black and brown communities the most, pushing them into the military to fight a war that they might not have clear understanding about, or have the articulation or the education about the way that Black folks struggle globally, in the ways that folks are kind of weaponized in the military complex. I'm also thinking about like imperialism as it relates to US occupancy, and we'll see the overlaps between the US occupancy and birthing injustice that has happened to folks who are a part of marginalized communities. And I'll also be breaking for water. Okay, so birth movement from the beginning. And picture are two Black midwives, Black and white photo. They're both holding medium to large size bags that look stuffed with instruments, tools used for their work. In the background, there is a wooden home and they are standing outside. Okay, so Black movement, a birth movement from the beginning. Black women have been leaders in the birth movement from the very beginning. Long before the term birth justice was coined, Black women used traditional childbearing knowledge, oral histories, human rights organizing, and policy work in their efforts to end inequities in maternal, infant, and child health. Building on resistance to the abuse of pregnant Black women during slavery and the dismantling of our birth traditions and family structures, our foremothers paved this way for today's birth justice activism. And this quote is from the author of Birthing Justice, and that text again will be listed in the reading list. And so pre-colonial birthing practices, people cared for and delivered traditional births using attendants who were members of their extended family. And so now we begin to see this overlap between birth, who are the folks supporting us in birth, who have traditionally been our family, folks in the community, folks we know and trust. And also that work in ways have been weaponized, particularly to impact women in ways that relate to, I think, gender roles, Western thinking around gender, and I think like this kind of misbalance of unshared labor, which is also an issue that relates to like Black feminism, and I think like a women's rights issue. And so I think in that same thinking, I'm thinking that birthing ceremonies, fertility practices were used to celebrate birth, while abortion doctors could perform abortions using herbal remedies. And so there are pieces of history that go way back that have examples of various type of ways that folks use to exercise their agency and body autonomy. Caregivers, grandmas, chosen family, play cousins, and play aunties are example of this kind of extension of family, community care, and the village that's needed to support the development of ourselves and our children. Community members would learn skills as apprentices and assistants while growing and taking on more responsibility until they would become midwives. And so also want to reflect on that example earlier around how the state kind of impacted midwives' ability to practice, but also a practice that has been traditional to African culture. And so this particular kind of way we see midwives become criminalized in contemporary terms. And so midwives would perform services in exchange of goods or many times without pay. Herbs, natural elements, and traditions were used for birthing and healing practices. And Black and non-Western countries have historically placed significant value and praise on children and elderly community members, which I would think now it feels in the US context that, and I think Bell Hooks talks about it All About Love too, about this kind of care or lack of care. A lot of abolitionist folks speak about this too, to certain marginalized groups, and that being children and young folks. And so we see that in this Western thinking, young folks are oppressed in a particular kind of way that traditional African culture just doesn't reflect. And so I'm going to go to the next slide here. So next we're going to talk about some rebellion that happened during enslavement. I do want to say that I'm using the term enslavement over identifying as like Black slaves in a way to identify that something happened to our people. Our people were enslaved and not consenting to this particular type of exploitation of labor and horrific conditions that they face. And for me, it feels like a shift in this sort of like repetition of power dynamic to illustrate that enslavement happened to them. And so the slides on the screen, one slide is a close-up photo of green okra with a red tablecloth in the backdrop. This second image reads, "Gynecology is rooted in medical abuse. We desperately need to throw the system away and build up proper full spectrum midwifery care." And so that's context for kind of what we'll be talking about now. So research on granny midwives documents midwives' role during the transatlantic slave trade and post-emancipation within Black communities, and illustrates how granny midwives was considered a true occupation because granny lacked formal education and training, not because grannies lack formal education and training, and discusses efforts employed to eliminate this kind of Southern midwife from birthing work in the early of 20th century. And so while enslaved, grand midwives, some of them who identified as that, were responsible for maintaining a healthy labor force. They also assisted with the majority of the births that took place in Southeast in the US. In some instances, Grannies provided contraceptive and abortion methods to Black and white women and served as spiritual healers and leaders within enslaved communities. Grannies also assisted slave revolts by transporting abolitionist and rebellion messages between plantations. Grannies engaged in various social arenas, unhinged thanks to the overall high esteem in which they were held within Southern society. However, changes in the structure of the US healthcare diminished this high regard towards grannies over time. So I do want to talk about how the variations of enslavement impact birthing folks and health outcomes. But I do want to share a story that I'm just going to give a warning if folks want to mute. It is a story related to infanticide in an effort to illustrate, I think the complexities and depths, but also the horrors of the impact of enslavement, but also how the state also is connected to this impact of enslavement to birthing folks. And so the example I'm using is of Margaret Garner, called Peppy, who passed in 1858, who was an enslaved African-American woman in pre-Civil War who killed her own daughter rather than allow the child to return to slavery. Gardner and her family escaped enslavement in January 1856 by traveling across the frozen Ohio River in Cincinnati, but they were apprehended by US Marshals under the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850. And this story later got turned into a novel and I think a movie by Toni Morrison called Beloved. But I'm bringing this into context to illustrate the kind of validity of how the impacts of enslavement and the state were to those birthing folks. And I'm also thinking about how particularly legislation and policy impacted folks being enslaved. And so when we think about contemporary examples of birthing justice, I want us to also be reflective of how there's kind of been this narrative of the US kind of imposing these sanctions that has led to death. And so enslaved birthing people would use hush harbors, poisoning, and abortifacient, which is a drug or device used to cause abortions, to practice rebellion resistance, even in moments where they were enslaved. And maroon communities gave those who were escaped the opportunity to live freely outside of state, outside of the law, and to self-determine their conditions. And so I think that's important to illustrate because I think some more normalized Western ideas of enslavement maybe capture folks who are enslaved as kind of being defenseless or not a part of this long history of resistance, especially as it applies to colonial settlerism, white patriarchal violence, and us being able to self-determine our conditions. And so related to herbs and things that were used to resist enslavement, enslaved people in South Carolina commonly prepared the seeds of the okra plant as a coffee substitute. Enslaved women sometimes use okra to achieve abortions by lubricating the uterine passage of pregnant women with the plant's slimy pods. In West Africa, women today still use okra to induce an abortion, employing much of the same method. Parts of cottonwood trees were also recorded as a tool for abortions as well. Enslavement impacted Black people's ability to be seen as legitimate, as human, equal, and valuable outside of labor exploitation. Some scholars argue that enslavement supported Western thinking of Black people seen as animalistic, lacking humanness, Black women were then, as a result of that, like not granted the ability to benefit from this ideology of womanhood. And so I do want to pause because that's something that I plan to kind of highlight again as we go through today, particularly as it relates to this sort of humanness that it feels like I think not only is promoted in contemporary ideas of birthing justice, but for calls for action against so many of the issues that marginalized folks experience. It's this issue of folks not being seen as legitimate human that will also relate as we begin to integrate more of like the medical field and quote unquote, right, modern medicine. There'll be overlaps in that as it relates to criminalization as well. And so in ways that the logical thinking have consistently not only harbored like US policy, but has led to criminalization that has impacted, that left marginalized folks being the predominant folks that are incarcerated. And I always like to tell people that it's not Black people are committing more quote unquote incidents of violence or quote unquote crime, because who gets to define that? But it's that those are the people that have the policy has been created specifically to target, and that's reinforced through economics, our social capacity in spaces. It's even reinforced by IG algorithms, right? It might be enforced how folks are orientated to Black birth, how folks are orientated to midwives and doulas. But I think it's important for us to consider kind of all of the elements of how we are being exploited in a particular way that silence our healthcare needs, but also our lives. Transphobia is deadly, and we'll get to that in a little bit as well. But I did want to kind of stress that. And so, yeah, so example I'm thinking about is this high birth maternal death rate for Black women, right? I think a thinking is like, how is this possible? But I think at its roots, and I think some of the resources that are included in the reading list will speak to that as well. So this kind of medical bondage, medical apartheid, this system that echoes the thinking of white supremacy structures in a way that ignores the needs of Black people, particularly in a way that speaks to not the legitimacy of them as humans, right? You don't need additional folks. A medical practitioner may argue folks not needing a Black person, right? Not needing a particular level of medical care, not needing a particular level of medication in the name of this kind of thinking that I think enslavement reinforced, but I think colonialism continues to reinforce daily, and neocolonialism. And this is in an effort to continue to produce white people. This is in an effort to produce eugenics. This is an effort to continue issues related to population control. And we'll keep kind of exploring this thinking. And so I'm also thinking about, as it kind of relates to hospital and that beginning thinking about the medical system, this idea of patriarchal medicine and Western knowledge, which I think both influence healthcare systems, our quality of life, access, but also influence how structures were created that criminalize Black birthing spaces, Black birthing practices, silenced, and also in some ways made this work illegal or not legitimate under the state, which is an itself a reflection of white supremacy. And so some of my thinking of that is in the 1950s began a white feminist natural birth movement that condemned medicalized births while ignoring the history of J. Marion Sims. And so in this example, J. Marion Sims is someone who is quote unquote known as this kind of leader in gynecology, invented this gynecological space. But I think on the screen, this kind of tweet illustrates that the idea of gynecology, its inception, its creation, its theoretical framework was rooted in the exploitation of Black people. And so in this way, we've seen organizing folks create petitions, have actions related to getting, for example, a J. Marion Sims statue removed in New York. But I think it's important that folks are using their agency to call attention to these histories. Most are rooted in these kind of founding fathers, which I think we know as there are overlaps between themes of like white supremacy, founding fathers, and all of the things as they relate in the same way where we see that impacted in various spaces, media, and culture. And so Sims was a doctor who performed torturous surgeries on Black birthing people. And then because of this thinking and because white feminists were pushing this particular kind of like natural birthing movement, and it's, I think it's in its main focus, it undermines the thinking in the work that Black birthing scholars and folks have done around calling attention to how Sims and other doctors in the history, right? And it's this kind of complicated medical history that have left folks hurt, that have left folks sterilized, and have shifted our ability to engage with the medical field. And so federal funding, insurance, and Medicaid through policy would not cover support for doulas, midwives, and traditional care that folks needed. And so that's another example of how the state, through funding, would interfere in birthing outcomes. And then this colonized theory that childbirth, some type of certificate, some type of legal regulation or education requirements in modern medicine also play efforts in silencing traditional birthing efforts. The professionalization of medicine by white male physicians pushed women into subordinated roles in birthing work during the late 19th and early 20th century. Midwives were considered unsafe, illegitimate, unqualified, unskilled, which was rooted in racist, ageist, and classic ideology, a reflection of white supremacy. We also see medicine spaces. We also see medical spaces, I think, as it relates to like contemporary Western thinking as spaces for fat phobia, transphobia, ageism, racism, and extensions of the state. And so there's all these overlaps of a person going to the hospital to receive care, but experiencing levels of oppression that impact their birthing outcome. And Black birthing people have experienced issues with arrest and detainment regulated to immigration and their nationality status. So folks have experienced being harassed by ICE while trying to deliver, while everyone has the right to birthing justice. And so, yeah, so continuing thinking about this overlap in the state and how the state is continuing to create a threat to potentially the lives of Black birthing folks. And so next, we are gonna think a little bit more about this kind of continued warfare on Black reproductive rights. And so pictured on the screen is an old newspaper image of a Black person holding a poster. Their background has other people. It looks like they could be at a protest. The poster reads, "Defend the right to safe, legal abortion for all women." And then the text on the screen, which is a quote, it reads, "According to the national study conducted by Princeton University in 1970, 21% of married Black women have been sterilized." And I think just to add context to that, in ways that folks were sterilized, folks we're not able to always consent. And so this also has resulted in lawsuits that we'll get into later. But again, I think this also speaks to the very important need for us to be, one, pro-abortion, because I think pro-abortion gives us the ability to be comprehensive in how we show up to support all rights in the ways that some different types of repo frameworks don't give the ability for all folks to be validated. But I also think it's important to consider how our health outcomes are impacted by the state, by Western medicine, and by a particular level of violence that those marginalized communities experience. And so thinking about this kind of Black reproductive rights beginning era, I'm thinking about a lot of different things. I'll read an excerpt from a New York Times article in a moment, but some things that are coming to mind, I'm thinking about like the 60s, 50s, 70s era. I'm thinking about Planned Parenthood. I'm thinking about like eugenics, liberal policy. I'm thinking about Roe versus Wade and the Hyde Amendment and Mohan's 1965 report, which not only was like transphobic, right, but also created this scarcity, population control, not even misogynistic, deadly thinking around birthing folks, rights, and agency. I'm also thinking about the connection between propaganda around population control and eugenics linked into our ability to be validated as people who have the right to live and our ability to be seen as human or our humanness. Some examples of this that are kind of coming up is this sterilization of Black women in North Carolina, the connection between the US base, that there was a US occupation in Puerto Rico, right, in the 60s, and which led to a US base. Relation to bases and military, the US has the most bases in the entire world, where nations and other countries see occupancy in countries as a threat of war or act of violence in itself. And so I'm just giving you more context as it relates to this particular case of US occupancy in Puerto Rico. This occupancy led to the sterilization of over 60% of Puerto Rican women, some who didn't know they were sterilized, some who couldn't even have a voice in it. They had to have their husband sign off or their husband's approval. And so there's a direct connection between the US occupying Puerto Rico and organizations popping up to go door to door to Puerto Rican homes while Puerto Rican women's husbands would be at work or birthing folks would be at home, and weaponizing birth control in a particular way that left folks uneducated about the impact, left folks unable to consent, and left folks sterilized as a result of this particular violence. And I think that's also in relation to most recently Haiti immigration and ICE detention centers. I mean, those practices reflecting the same criminalization of Black people, because I think Ukraine is a great example of that, right? We see the US in some ways and other countries moving to aid in the Ukraine in a particular way, when in ways where folks have been fighting to end SARS in occupation and military in other countries, southern countries in Africa, and there hasn't been this same public outcry in the ways that I think kind of go back to our humanness, and policy and social norms being created that don't even question why we may not aid a country in the southern, right? But we may run to aid a country, Europe, or in some type of like Western association. And so I just want folks to like keep that in context, keep this idea of like white supremacy, war, who was impacted by war, who was impacted by Western medical culture, Western medical traditions, and how does this connect to this sort of humanness that Western thinking took away from our birthing access and our birthing outcomes, because there's been this criminalization and this illegitimacy to midwives and doulas and this kind of traditions that are rooted in Black folks' experiences and ancestral work. So this next slide reads birth control, sterilization, and repro rights. There is a photo, and there are 3 people standing in the kind of frame. 2 people are holding posters. They look like they may be at a rally. The poster, closest and readable, reads, "Sterilization of mothers violates UN Charter Act 25, Section 1 and 2. Vote no, House Bill 20." And then it's from a newspaper clipping, and the title of the newspaper reads, "People who California sterilized can now apply for reparation payments." And in the link of resources from the reading list that will be sent out, there is a link that gives more information about this California sterilization that folks are now have the potential to receive reparations from. And so the site has sort of questions and answers if you need more information, as well as how this form of reparations works. And so I'm also situating this with thinking about abortion as an act of self-defense by Audre Lorde. And I'm situating this in sort of this time period of the 1960s. And so a former chairwoman of the Black Panther Party shifted organizing thinking that moved from centering a woman's role as having children to a platform for Black women's reproductive rights in 1977, referring to Elaine Brown, who said this quote, "Then I support every assertion of human rights by women, from the right to abortion to the right of equality with men as laborers and leaders." And I do want to just like acknowledge nuance in this presentation today, how the term like women is continued being used, especially as like a non-binary person. I want to acknowledge the complexes, but also like limitness that historical figures have used to interrogate gender roles and gender oppression. And I also want to say that this quote is not necessarily a claim that feminism or particular this thinking is like acting, or my feminism is acting for equality, right? Because that's not something that I believe in, but I do believe in folks being treated as humans, folks being treated with dignity, respect, honor, and that's not always something that men experience, right? And so that's not necessarily my politic, but I'm just using it as a context for us today. Okay, cool. So I want to keep talking about this conversation of birth control, sterilization, particularly as it relates to like Black leadership, especially as it relates to Black male leadership. And yeah, so I want to read an excerpt, and it's from How Black Feminists Define Repro Rights. It is available on New York Times. So if you just go to New York Times and type that in, you'll be able to find it, and it'll also be a part of the reading list. And so it's first thinking about the Mohan report, which I talked about a little bit ago, that basically was this report around the quote unquote Black family, which I think I'm pushing back against what that means, particularly as it relates to nuclear family, particularly as it relates to cis heteronormativity, which this space is pushing back against. And so it's naming that the Mohan was criticized for essentially blaming Black women for the poverty and hardship that shaped the lives of their families. In a speech a year after the report was published, the SNCC leader, Stokely Carmichael, said, "To set the record straight, the reason we are in the bag we are in isn't because of my mama. It's because of what they did to my mama. We have to put the blame on where it belongs," end quote. But for many other Black men, Mohan provided a framework in which they could understand their marginalization and attempt to repair the damage by reasserting their rightful positions as patriarchs. Assuming this role meant denouncing birth control and abortion as tools of genocide that compromise the future and freedom of Black families. In 1971, the comedian activist Dick Gregory, I don't know if this is some of y'all face, but Dick Gregory wrote a cover story for Ebony that began, "My answer to genocide, quite simply, is 8 kids and another baby on the way." Gregory, who never quotes his wife in the article or even mentions her name, goes on to claim that birth control and abortion both had been designed to limit the Black population, describing them casually as methods of genocide. Speaking to the US Commission on Population Control in 1971, the Reverend Jesse Jackson said, "Virtually all the security we have is the number of children we produce." And so in my mind, when I'm reading this, I'm thinking about how Black leaders, particularly as Black cisgender men, have been divisive in this reproductive rights movement in ways that not only promoted white supremacy thinking, but it demeaned Black women and Black birthing folks in an effort to gain some legitimacy to this sort of respectable family that these Black leaders are kind of adhering to. And I think the Mohan Report adheres to as well. And so just bringing that in context, I want folks to be thinking about Black birthing work and Black birthing justice as it relates to our ability and legitimacy for humanness, as it relates to our ability to make the decision for ourselves. I think in a lot of that thinking and rhetoric, which was so violent, but I think a lot of it also was rooted in this, I would say like purity culture, I would say like this chivalry idea, and I always like to engage people around those thoughts that are, I think, inherently paternal, but in ways that a person who may be woman presenting, femme presenting, would need help with the door, that because we aren't able to properly do it, right? Which was why we would need help. And then like an engagement would be like you claiming me and like trading me for a deer. But I think it's just in that same vein of thinking is kind of what I'm getting at. Like, it's the same vein of thinking of like this nuclear family that we know is inherently harmful, not only like in its way that it's transphobic, but in the way that it limits our ability to see family, our ability to self-determine, which Black folks have also always fought for. And in the way that Black political figures, those cis men, have kind of been divisive to that. There's been Black birthing justice happening and rebelling and combating that. So I'm moving to the next slide, and it reads, "Birthing justice should honor its leaders and ancestors." And so some of the folks I have listed, I think there's so many names of folks who have been holding this Black birthing justice work, who deserve space I think a part of this Black birthing justice work is honoring our ancestors, honoring where we've been, honoring the work that folks have already done to give us the tool to exist today outside of the state, to be able to self-determine, to be able to care for ourselves. A part of that are folks like Claudia Jones, who's a Black-led feminist communist who constantly spoke about the conditions that were impacting birthing folks, particularly as it relates to women, as it relates to birth, as it relates to access to abortions. Also, Combahee River Collective folks, we know this is a group of lesbian folks, queer folks who were socialists, and I think a lot of folks kind of leave that out in conversations about them too, which I think is important not to, because their socialism and their political ideology, especially as a class analysis, is very important to how we think about birthing access, the overlaps as it relates to like environmental degradation, climate injustice, issues in the medical field. And so I think they really gave a lot of like language and tools for how feminism was not particularly a fight for Black feminism, right? Was not particularly the fight for equal rights for men, but it was the fight for women and the issues that related to things like birth. Folks were able to self-determine and have that agency. I also have Sister Song here, who I refer to in a few moments, who have been doing work consistently in a contemporary aspect around Black birthing justice, who have held so many panels, conferences and spaces for folks to get together, which I think kind of echoes that agitate, educate, and action element that I'm hoping that this space kind of evokes as well. The last person I want to honor is the founder of the Harlem Birthing Action Committee. They'll also be listed in the reading list, but this person is a midwife who had over 20 years of experience and founded this space, which has been integral to helping not only like flame and continue this legacy of midwifery and birthing justice, but echoing the work of those who came before us, practices that were pre-colonial, practices that Black folks used to celebrate birth far before Western time, far before Western conception. I'm also highlighting someone who's not listed, Fannie Lou Hamer, who's an organizer, who was an organizer and has been impacted, right, by issues related to sterilization. And so Hamer's uterus was unconsensually removed while she underwent a surgery to remove a tumor in 1961. First sterilization was a popular practice committed by white doctors against African women. And I want us to keep thinking about this kind of medical space as the space of Western thinking, as the space of echoing this kind of white supremacy thought as it relates to our humanness, as it relates to our rights, as it relates to our agency. And so I'm also thinking about that in a way that like shouldn't like shame individual doctors, but in a way that like calls folks in, even myself, right, about the systems that are interplaying and how we engage in every aspect of each other with each other. And so ways that on an individual level, right, a person might not be intentional to enact violence upon a Black person, a Black birthing person. We know that systems, right, so hence the terms kind of systematically, that's how these structures are designed. And so in the same ways that a police officer might not have been trained to be racist, we know that while police officers are training, they get Black people to kind of aim and shoot at during their weapons training, right? And so that isn't separate from the ways that Black folks have been not only criminalized, but also in the ways that folks have been literally killed because of the state, which the police is kind of extension of. And so I do want to take a moment to talk a little bit about criminalization. There'll be, again, like links to the reading list of stuff that's coming up around criminalization, but I'm thinking again how midwives were particularly considered illegal if they didn't have this sort of Western training. I'm thinking about the amount of Black birthing folks who have been incarcerated while giving birth, but also who the system of policing and prisons kind of create conditions where most of the people that are incarcerated in the women's prison are folks who are survivors, are folks who may be a parent, are folks who may be living in low poverty, right? Working class folks. And so I'm thinking about all the overlaps and how like systems exist, how they impede on each other, and how issues like class have to be important for us to address. Issues like identifying what is the state and what do we want to do to reflect our own agency to exist and self-determine our conditions. And so this next slide reads transmisogyny, bioessentialism. I spelled that wrong, but I'm good. Fuck English language, colonized language, hashtag. Anti-trans and anti-abortion bills, and there's a lot of overlap in that, which we'll get to in a moment. So there is a tweet on the screen that reads, "The term woman makes me giggle so much because it gives very much caveman, very much, I don't even know this second word, Neanderthal, very much crows, Flintstones." Like, I think this is, I'm using it kind of like as a way for us to like joke about kind of the complexities and the politics as it relates to our identities, but in a way that confronts how I think in some ways, some African-based thinking and teachings have been rooted in the exploitation and the oppression of other African people. And so what's so important when we think about Black birthing justice is that Black birthing justice has never looked like, or Black birthing people has never looked monolithic, and it won't in the future. And so in ways that, in this case, someone identifying as a woman would be maybe like a hoteptress, giving like little hoteptress, we see that as also an attempt to silence communities, as an attempt to control populations, as an attempt at eugenics. And so all of these systems kind of connect, right? And so it's like prisons, yes, and eugenics, right? Prisons lead to lesser lifespans. And so all of the things that relates to our ability to live, exist, are impacted by how we navigate our communities, how we acknowledge the humanness of each other as Black folks, and how we must really address how many of the roots that are creating oppression of another group, are silencing another group, are rooted in white supremacy thinking, even as it relates to fat phobia, even as it relates to ableism, because as we know the history of Black people, African people, there hasn't been this kind of desire to learn in the framework of Western thinking. There hasn't been this desire to even, I think, like quantify our mental health needs, right? In the way that Western medical and medicine kind of thinks. And I think even as it relates to like ancestral and spiritual practices, which can't be quantified through the Western medical system. And so to think about this a little bit more, I want to define biological essentialism. And so I'll just say that this is how it's defined, and I'm bringing up this term in a way to promote Black birthing justice and Black birthing justice as it pertains to being expansive to all genders and all communities, that biological essentialism, which is something that I think is reflected in this tweet, but also some thinking that I kind of see from my peers when folks push back against birth, motherhood, and things that speak to kind of like this biology, which I think in another workshop, I can probably get into details about, or like maybe dispute X, Y, X chromosome and like shit like that, right? Because what? But anyway, so it's defined as the belief that human nature and individuals' personality or some specific qualities such as intelligence, creativity, homosexuality, masculinity, femininity, is an innate and natural essence rather than a product of circumstances, upbringing, and culture. The concept is typically invoked where there is a focus on difference, as where females are seen as essentially different from males. I'm using the biological term in the kind of connection to this example, y'all. I'm sorry, it's gross. And then my example is like, see, gender essentialism. But this example was kind of bringing up how essential thinking of like man versus woman or binary in itself kind of like in itself, it doesn't count it, it does in itself evokes this diverseness between like the differences in thinking, right? And so I think this tweet is an example of that. This person is identifying as someone who is different from another person who may identify as a woman, right? And they feel so passionate about it, they have to spell it in that way. But I think in their effort to identify, which I don't personally think is a result of identity, they eluded this transphobia, which is a result of colonialization, is a result of white supremacy, right? Because we know like the idea of blue being for boys and pink being for girls are examples and like reflections of white supremacy. And so this line of reasoning formed the cornerstone of traditional patriarchal structures, right? This idea that men are stronger, less emotional, better suited to lead. It persists today in the form of gender roles, gender-based exclusion, and transphobia. Bioessentialism reduce people to their individual body parts, which limit us in our humanness. And so now moving to kind of thinking about this anti-trans, anti-abortion era, Republicans at the state level have wedged battles on both abortion and trans rights. Both types of bills are funded by the same corporations. And so I think white supremacy, we talked about capitalism, but I think that's a good example of like funding related to certain agendas that benefit certain groups of people who are white, people who want white people to be supreme. And so this particular bill, which was signed into law by Texas Governor Greg Abbott last year, not only bans abortions after 6 weeks of pregnancy, but also deputized citizens to enforce it, allowing any person to bring a lawsuit against an entity who aids or evades an abortion procedure for damages of at least $10,000. I think that's a good example of the ways that like the state have weaponized communities against each other in a way that calls to individuals to act in a way that affirms the government, the government's thinking, the government's idea, instead of, and further criminalize folks, right? Instead of something that's affirming to like all groups of people. And so some states are attempting to look to remove gender affirming care that is not only life-saving for some folks, but takes away our ability to make decisions about our own bodies. Both issues, the issues of abortion bans, the issue of trans bans, gender affirming care, bathroom rhetoric, things like that. They are related to access to healthcare, eugenics, and ableist thinking and anti-Black ideologies related to humanness and matter. This is continued tack on agency, autonomy, and Puritan culture thinking. And so as it relates to politics and legality, these laws and policies deny people the right to control their bodies, interfere with their reproductive decision-making, and ultimately prevent many people from being able to live a dignity in a safe and healthy communities. I think there's a connection as well between like these current bills, even as it relates to Black liberalism, right? Because we see recently that the vice president, the president, they like are making these stakes and they're going to stand against Black maternal health, right? But in the same ways that they've said this before, they have not initiated any policy, any bills. They also have in their presidency, in their ways that they've promoted war, promoted incarceration, actually worked in rebuttal to that and participate in causing additional Black maternal health. So I think that's important to consider. I also think it's important to consider contemporary spaces like how are corporations playing a role in reproductive injustice, right? If you work at Amazon and you work excruciating hours, how is your body impacted by that as someone who may need that income to live? And in the ways that how is sort of quote unquote feminized labor looked to in a way that silences folks, in a way that doesn't speak to the fullness, but also may create more instances of potential threat of violence. I'm also thinking about this in like contemporary thinking that I feel like in some ways Black feminist spaces have to be accountable to, like how are our spaces showing up, not just like saying these things like, for example, land liberation, right? But how is the work reflective of the conditions that we want and need? What is the relationship between white supremacy and Black feminist work today, Black birthing justice work today? Because for me, it feels like a disservice when folks kind of tiptoe around who is to blame, right? And yeah, I think it's just important to think about this in like our future work. And so I'm kind of here, we at Repo Futurism with it. So the picture on the right is a photo of 3 kind of copper metal sculptures. They look to resemble 3 figures. They may be femme presenting, they may be women, but the photo is identified as Mothers of Gynecology, which is an installation that was put in Montgomery, Alabama, of the women who were tortured and experimented on by J. Marion Sims. And so I think I think some of the thinking was the same in the ways that Sims kind of sculptures came down. A lot of folks are talking more about how Black birthing folks were impacted by the torture. And this kind of installation is a result of that, and it's in Montgomery, Alabama. On the left is a tweet. It is a photo pictured of Santana, and the tweet says, "Waiting on my homegirl to pick me up from the abortion clinic so we can hit happy hour." And I think at the beginning, I talked a bit about like this space being pro abortion in the way that like people have the right to decide, but also that people have a right to access to abortions. And so in the perfect world where Black birthing justice is promoted and regarded, folks have the autonomy to celebrate if they want to celebrate at their abortion, to be able to get their nails and toes done at a spa that has abortion access. And so I think it's important to like complicate this word, complicate reprofuturism. I'll just kind of wind us down with this last kind of thinking. Through the efforts of the birthing justice movement, gender varied folks, gender oppressed folks, women of color, women, Black birthing folks are entering midwifery training and becoming midwives in records number. At the same time, the number of home births is rising in Black communities. Issues of reproductive and birthing justice are directly related to criminalization, environmental degradation, healthcare, social class, popular culture depictions of Black women in media, and access to non-cis-centered feminized healthcare, right? And so that means healthcare that doesn't center cis women, that doesn't center hetero folks, that can be expansive to all communities. Reproductive and birthing justice is giving our communities the knowledge and power to continue to sustain and build power. And so that's kind of me closing up this space, or closing out this space. If folks want to support me, Cam, my Cash App is there, Venmo is there, PayPal is there, the babies are outside, birthing justice, yes. Babies and people in DC and youth need playgrounds. And my email is there as well if folks are interested in collaborating with me for some facilitation, workshop, that type of thing. I am done with my presentation. Thank y'all so much for being engaging and spending time here. I hope folks are able to learn, come away with tools that could be helpful in their future work. I hope folks feel empowered by the rebellion, resistance, and the level of organizing and engaging and care and love that Black birthing justice has been a part of forever. And I'm going to mute because my background loud.
Thank you so much, Cam. I really appreciate all that you do, and just for such a wonderful teaching. I just want to read, folks are saying, thank you, incredible. Someone said beautiful picture, by the way. And someone said, thank you. This has been super informative, and I'm eager to go through the reading list, which will be posted on blackwomenradicals.com, right, shortly after, soon. And also this teaching is available, right, on Black Women Radicals YouTube, or on YouTube, okay? So you can come back and take some more notes, all sorts of things. So Cam, you have a few questions, right? And I also want to honor your time and all sorts of things, but we have a few people have questions for you. And I will also be reading the questions aloud and then sharing the questions in the chat, okay? So the first question someone asked, due to the disparities in conditions like gestational diabetes and preeclampsia, a disproportionate number of Black birthing people will come into contact with the medical system at some point in pregnancy. Beyond working to diversify the field, how can medical and allied health professionals, particularly those of us who are Black and do know the history of gynecology, forced sterilization, the race logic behind VBAC calculators, and other coercive practices against Black birthing people in medicalized settings, better partner with Black birth workers and organizers to empower Black birthing people?
Yes, that's such a good question. So I think some of the folks that were highlighted in like leaders in this work, but also folks that will be included in the reading list, are like communities orgs that are like holding that space now. And so in ways that I think it could, I think depending on the context, be useful to have maybe some sort of association with a hospital. I have seen midwives, doulas, create their own ecosystems, create their own like systems to like be in community and engage with one another. To be honest, I think like folks have access to like Facebook groups, Black midwives Facebook groups. Folks are in the South organizing and have space for that as well. So I would say it's important for us to build community and care that's not reflective and accessible to the state in a way. And for me, that has looked like not getting funding for specific people because there is a connection to the state, right? But I also think Black folks, especially in the age of COVID, we've been able to like fundraise, we've been able to show up for each other in a particular way that I think could be done outside of traditional or like Western hospitals. And that there are like ecosystems of care, birthing justice of folks kind of coast to coast, different cities who are already doing this work, who have the knowledge, who have the skills, who even hold spaces virtually. Like I know the cannabis doula is someone who I follow, right, who holds space and who holds workshops as it relates to how Black birthing folks engage with cannabis during pregnancy or when they're with the child. So yeah, I'm thinking about all the ways that like we can turn into each other, toward each other, to get our needs met and to build that capacity that may not be aligned with the state, but that is relying on a long tradition of like Black folks needing each other, Black folks being in community, Black folks resisting state practices for the betterment of their care.
Thank you so much, Cam. I also wanted to share, someone had asked previously when you were, doing your amazing teaching, but someone asked, forgive me if I'm saying your name incorrectly, Jalicia, can you please repeat the abolitionist work of midwives on plantations? You mentioned they carried message. Can you please repeat? I've been having connection issues.
Yeah, no problem. So there's this long history of connection of like family to midwives, to midwifery, and like care, but not only like care, but like as it pertains to resistance abolitionist efforts. And so in ways that granny midwives, which is kind of like derogatory or like as an extension of grandmas who would like help birthing folks, grandma midwives would travel to different places to help give birth, right? Because they were giving birth to enslaved Black people, but also white people as well. They had more accessibility to travel. And so in that effort, in that vein, they were able to like translate messages and share information with folks like traveling and attempting escapes, succeeding in escape, and using their agency and power to kind of leverage against the institution of enslavement.
Thank you so much, Cam. So someone else asked, thanks for this, Cam. What are your thoughts on environmental oppression and Black birthing justice?
I think it's directly connected in ways that like we know folks who are Black, folks who may be working class or low income may live in neighborhoods that have worse air quality, right? And so in some ways, when people are like, well, racism doesn't impact everything like air, it does, right? And so asthma, issues with clean air circulation, all impact our health outcomes, our quality of life, right? And so in ways that your next door in some communities, right, it might be used as like a dumping ground. There may be some folks who like just dump junk there, and that has impacted the health outcome of folks in the ways that like Hurricane Katrina impacted the health outcome, birthing qualities of folks, right? And we know that stress is a very important element in the ways that it can impact health outcome. It can impact your birthing experience. The complexities as it relates to, I think, folks even having this maybe in apprehensive of the medical industry is also kind of a result of things that they've experienced, facing environmental injustice, going to the hospital, that not being validated, going to the hospital, thinking their child may have lead poisoning, the hospital not validating that, and then that being an extension of our quality of lives, our measure of like humanness in that right as well.
Got it. Thank you so much, Cam, for that offering. So I'm trying to see. Someone asked, can you explain further how that tweet alludes to transphobia, that tweet that you showed or shared, excuse me.
Mm-hmm. So it does in the way that it alludes to, in one way, right? That it alludes to this kind of definition I was reading about bioessentialism. And so in ways that identifying as a particular person, a particular identity, because of your physical aspect, specifically as it relates to your femaleness or your maleness in that binary way, in itself is inherently transphobic, right? In itself is inheriting this system of thinking that values a particular kind of people, right? A particular kind of womb or WOMB, right? Instead of this thinking that Western gender oppresses all groups of gendered oppressed people, right? And in the ways that Western thinking oppresses folks through its transphobia, the thinking that our value is measured by our body parts, by our ability to like create, right, is limited in itself and oppressive to other groups of people, right? Because I think it's also oppressive to potentially someone who may have had, like Fannie Lou Hamer, right? For example, someone who may have had a procedure of sterilization, right? Who can't, quote unquote, conceive whatever this kind of thinking is. It can be oppressive to them because it's this thinking that you are more valuable than someone who may not be able to have kids, whether you think it's biological or whatever reason. I think it's kind of in that vein. And I think it's also in the vein of like, it's like a tipping of like, or a real dangerous thinking that in some ways, I think like minimizing our experience to like just being people who give birth or just being people who kind of go get the meat, like the herder and like the preparer, or whatever those dynamics is called. It's like in that same vein, in that same thinking, all under the umbrella of like white supremacy thinking, because we know like in indigenous cultures and African cultures, folks, there are documents of folks who were trans, right? Folks who were two-spirited, who did exist and who had validity and who were important to their communities. And so it just isn't a reflection of African history or a kind of thinking that promotes Black liberation for everyone and not a woman or that kind of thinking.
Thank you, Cam. And so this is the final question. Do you think it is worthwhile for medical professionals who are trying to address racism in medicine to work towards legislative change? I'm working with the group in this team, but it feels futile from the federal lens. I feel like community and grassroots cooperation is more useful.
I think that's a good question. I think it's a lot of factors with like timing, possibility. For me, I think in organizing I've done around like legislation, I felt a particular kind of like gaslighting from politicians, because I think it's a lot of, we can't do this, we don't have the ability. But what have seen, and I think what I've learned from like comrades organizing, is that our priority wasn't legislation, like that was a part of the work, but our priority was like door to door, right? Our priority was like maybe canvassing or wheat pasting, building relationships in community, holding spaces at public libraries, rather than devoting our time and capacity to like this kind of legal lens. And yeah, so I think it's like both and, but I also think the priority should be community care. Because if we can like shift our community thinking, Black people historically haven't been people who've like sided with the state, right? So it's not like if you tell a Black person about the history of criminalization that they won't believe you because they've probably experienced a certain level of police violence in their life, right? And I think it's been important to like radically engage with like neighbors, like those little things, like being nice to people, like using your skills that like you can knit and you've knitted something for a neighbor at this street. And so you've been able to build community that way. I think it's so much more in like us just talking to each other than potentially being gaslighted and stalled by legislation. And so I think in ways that you can move legislation within the acknowledgement of like, this may not even be how communities respond. Because like, for example, my community, like we just got a bike lane. It took like all of the parks, but Black people don't even use it. They use the sidewalk and the white people are only people that use the bike lane. And so it's like this thinking that like legislation, changes, policy aren't always what shifts thinking in community. Is like community, right? And so if there was some buy-in from Black people who rode bikes in the community that they wanted a bike lane, then maybe people would engage with it with a different way instead of this kind of new law that took all the parks away like in 48 hours and folks were like mad and trying to scramble and organize around that.
Wow, thank you so much, Cam, for this very generative, powerful teaching. Thank you for talking about, what resonated with me was when you said that it's imperative for us to acknowledge our ancestors and those who came before us, who've always been doing this work, and acknowledging this long lineage of Black folks who have always been a part of these or enacting these birthing practices. And thank you for uplifting the Harlem birthing committee. Thank you for doing that. And also just wanted to say that Cam will be leading another teach-in in September at New Being Human in person, y'all. We will have directions or notifications about COVID protocol, but really, really excited for Cam to lead another teach-in, their expertise, their leadership. And it's always a joy to work with Cam. And I just want to say thank you so much again. Once again, this teach-in will be available on our YouTube because I know folks probably still have notes that need to take and some questions, right? So this will always be there to reference. And also Cam's information. I hope y'all took a photo or screenshotted something, but make sure you reach out to Cam and also support their work. And just once again, thank you, Cam. We appreciate you so much.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Black women radicals. Screw Black women politics.
And also want to shout out, thank you, Jason, for the live closed captioning. Really appreciate you so much. Just want to read a comment. Thank you for the transformative wisdom. Definitely, Cam. Thank you again. All right, y'all. I hope y'all have a great day. And please support Cam Morris and all the amazing work that they do. All right. Be well, y'all. Bye.